everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Marcia Eli. I come to you from the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library, and BPL presents the library's Arts and Culture team. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome Ben Raines, author of the new book, The Last Slave Ship, the true story of how Clotilda was found, her descendants, and an extraordinary reckoning. It is Raines who in 2019 discovered the infamous ship, which brought the last enslaved Africans to America and then disappeared for 160 years. The book is a powerful, timely narrative described by the Washington Informer as an action-packed, whip-smart, true account that's filled with science, history, and compassion. Raines' conversation partner tonight is Professor Sowande Mustakeem. So before I introduce the two of them, I have a few very quick notes. First, we are going to put in the chat a link to the website of a local Brooklyn bookstore, the community bookstore, so that you can easily, with a click or two, explore the book and purchase it if you're so inclined. Second, like all of our talks, you have the option to use closed captioning. That button is at the bottom of your screen. And finally, and most importantly, you're invited to share your questions tonight. Just type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will take as many as possible towards the end of the program. Now, let me say a word or two about each of our guests and hand it off to them. Ben Raines is an award-winning environmental journalist, filmmaker, and charter captain who lives in Fairhope, Alabama. His earlier book is called Saving America's Amazon, the threat to our nation's most biodiverse river system. Hi, Ben.
Okay, I was muted. I'm back.
Good to see you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Sowande M. Mustakeem is a historian with specializations in slavery at sea, medicine, Black women's history, terror, violence, policing, and public memory. She's currently an associate professor in the departments of history and African American studies at Washington University. She is the author of the award-winning book, Slavery at Sea, Terror, Sex, and Sickness in the Middle Passage. Welcome, Sowande. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm excited to hear this conversation, so I'm going to disappear and hand it off to you. Thank you both for being here.
Okay. All right, and thank you to everyone being here this evening and for seeing value for these incredible conversations that we're about to have this evening. So again, I want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library, and more importantly, for bringing us, both myself and Ben, into direct conversation with the world all at once. So Ben, I have to start. You open up, pull me in immediately. A secret beneath the murky waters of an Alabama swamp has been revealed. A secret in Alabama. So can you maybe pull back and tell us how you came to this secret? Then we'll talk a little bit more about the secret. And then I'll follow up with something else that perhaps is even connected with believability of African Americans or Africans. So let's start with what drew you in?
So I was an investigative reporter here in Mobile for 20 years. And I did a lot. I was an environmental journalist, primarily writing about contamination often in minority communities, just like Africatown. And so in that 20 years, I never once thought about looking for the Clotilda. And it was this sort of urban legend almost in Mobile, where people said, oh yeah, there's the Clotilda, but you know, they just talk about that in Africatown. And it was kind of dismissed, but there was a big mural you would drive by all the time. You know, my association with Africatown was that there were big paper mills there and asphalt factories and a lot of sewer spills. And I would go, you know, one of my first stories here in Mobile 20 some years ago was a woman who, every time it rained, her yard flooded with raw sewage. And I would go there and I would put her in the paper over and over, and we would be talking about across a moat of sewage. So that was Africatown. You know, to me, that was like I was trying to fix these problems and stuff. So a few years ago, a buddy of mine who used to work at the paper with me, Jeff Duke, called me up and said, hey, you should look for the Clotilda. And I didn't really even understand at that point, this was 2017, I didn't really even understand it was lost. I just knew the last slave ship had come into Mobile. I didn't know the whole story that involved burning the ship to hide it, and that it had been illegal to bring in enslaved people when it happened and all that stuff. My friend had heard a local historian on the radio, who's actually the city of Mobile historian, and he said, this is the greatest mystery in America's maritime history. If we could ever find the Clotilda, that would really be something. So I'm on the phone. My friend says, you got to look for the Clotilda. And I just dismissed it. I was like, that's like looking for pirate treasure. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to find a ship that's been missing for 160 years. But we hung up the phone and I typed Clotilda into Google and was instantly sucked in, bought all the books and started going to the primary historical documents that were, many of them housed in Mobile in the public library and places like that. And that's how I got started. And here we are now.
Well, I have to say, thank you for that, because it's interesting when we move beyond a legend and then begin to actually give credit to truth that has been transmitted. So even by the fourth page, we're hearing descendants saying that we were called liars and that we weren't believed. So what was it that made you believe this story, this these many Black people who had passed along a long history and herstory?
Well, one of the key elements had to be Sylviane Diouf's book, and it's Dreams of Africa in Alabama. And the moment I started reading that, it is such a well-documented history. There's no denying it. It was very clear to me. This all happened. This is all true. This ship is somewhere in this giant swamp north of Mobile, which is called the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, where I happen to make part of my living as a river guide. I take people in my boat and we go, look, this is the most diverse swamp in the most diverse river system in North America. And this is a quick little side, but Alabama has more species of fish, turtles, salamanders, snails, mussels, you name it, aquatic creatures than any other state, and has more species per square mile than any other state. So that's my association with the swamp. I've been writing about it and studying it for 20 some years. And so I was already intimately familiar with it. And the mayors famously, the family that did the Clotilda mission, it was this man, Timothy Mayer, who was a steamboat captain in Alabama and became very, very prosperous and prominent, had 9 steamboats, and basically became one of the richest people on the Gulf Coast, moving cotton up and down the rivers. And he owned plantation, and his brothers all had plantations. So they're still here. Their descendants are still here. There's a state park that I launch my boat from all the time that is Mayer State Park, named after one of the brothers who participated in the Clotilda, in bringing these, kidnapping these people and bringing them in. So that's how present they are in modern day Mobile. And so that, it was right there. And I was like, well, if that ship is in that swamp, which I know intimately, and this is a big swamp, it's about 13 miles wide and about 60 miles long. So imagine that for a minute. We're talking about 250,000 acres, and they supposedly burned a ship somewhere in there. So that was kind of I knew it was real. I knew these were real people. Their descendants were here, and it wasn't that long ago. I have had interactions with one of the members of the Mayer family, who was Timothy Mayer's great-grandson. He just died a few weeks ago, but that's how close this is. The descendants in Africatown are great-great or great-grandchildren. This is not that long ago. And I just thought I could tease out the mystery if I started digging into it.
Well, thank you for believing the story and then again, pursuing the mystery. So let's dive into the mystery. I really want to start with the bet, because something so casual would then lead to absolute destruction of lives. So can we start there possibly?
Yeah, and so the bet is very famous. Timothy Mayer famously made a bet on his steamboat one night that he could bring in a load of enslaved people. And one of the things I did was tease out why he made this bet, what was going on in America that made him make this bizarre bet, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. And so to set the stage, bringing in enslaved people had been outlawed in 1808. There was when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, there was they were trying to kind of cater to the southern states, and they said, all right, we're not going to do anything regarding slavery for 20 years. And 20 years to the day after they made that deal in the Constitutional Congress and all that, Thomas Jefferson signed a new law making it illegal to bring in enslaved people in 1808. So flash forward, we are now in 1859 on the deck of Mare's steamboat. And there's this debate going on. And so, this was, picture antebellum Alabama, the South, plantations, big hoop skirts. That's the world we're in. Incredible wealth here in Mobile. Very wealthy people are on Mare's steamboat with him. And it's after dinner, they're out on the deck, they're smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and talking. And what they were talking about is a case that was going on in Georgia regarding a ship called the Wanderer. And a flamboyant playboy there named Charles Augustus Lamar, ridiculous name, who was mixed up in horse racing and gold mining, he was wasting his family's massive wealth all kinds of ways. And so he sent a ship to Africa with the idea, his dad was cutting him off financially because he was just a spendthrift. So he came up with the idea of, I can send a ship to Africa and buy humans for $100 and bring them back here and sell them for $1,500. So he was literally trying to make money. And so he sent this ship. It came back to Georgia. They offloaded the people. And then a few weeks later, word was out and he got arrested and they put him on trial. Trial was covered nationwide. The New York Times was writing about it, the New York Tribune. In fact, Charles, the man I mentioned, famously challenged the editors of both the New York Times and the New York Tribune to duels. And during his court case, he challenged a Navy Commodore who was testifying against him to a duel, and they went out in the street and magically missed each other. So this guy's on trial for his life because illegal slaving was a hanging offense. It was a capital crime. So Mare and the people on his boat were talking about that case. And there were a couple of Yankees on the boat, and one of them said, I think they should hang the lot of them to scare everyone else off from doing this, talking about people bringing in slaves. Well, the South's economy was tied up in the price of slaves. So in the northern slave states, Maryland, Virginia, you could buy a person for about $500. But down in South Alabama, in Alabama period, in Georgia, where they were really growing cotton, the price of enslaved people had tripled or quadrupled. So they were $1,500 or $2,000. Now you have to understand, in today's money, we're talking about $55,000, a huge amount of money, a big increase. So a lot of people wanted to reopen the Atlantic slave trade so that the price of people would go back down to, like Charles said, oh, I can get them for $100 in Africa. That was the whole story of the Alamo. That whole deal was trying to make Texas a slave state. We hear this, oh, save the Alamo, but there's another story there. So on the deck of the boat, Mare says, nonsense, they'll hang nobody. I could do it myself and bring in a load inside of 2 years. And he set about doing it. And within about 8 months, he had accomplished the task. And he'd won this bet he made. And his reason was a little bit different than Charles, who was trying to raise money. Mare wanted to thumb his nose at the government. He wanted to be a man of action. He wanted to aggressively say, I can do this. And so the whole time the ship was sailing to Africa, he bragged all over Mobile that he had done this. So much so that the point that the local paper ran an article saying the Clotilda has gone to Africa for a load of slaves. And that ran in papers around the country, which later came back to haunt him. But we can get into that in a minute.
Thank you. Yes, again, going back to what may seem so casual, but quite the statement to say, I'm going to take on the government while an economy is crumbling, and then and then also being inspired openly, then for that to be in the media while this is now illegal. Yeah. So let's talk about the voyage. Well, the passage over, but more importantly, the world of deals that he would walk into. So you're going with confidence, but then let's talk about where he went and then the world that he went into.
Well, so an important caveat here, Mare didn't go. He hired somebody to go because he was trying to put somebody else at risk. So he hired this man, Captain William Foster. Mm-hmm. And Foster gathered up a group of itinerant sailors, men of the mast, as he called them. But he he sought out people who had no family connections in Mobile. You have to see Mobile back then was the, so the ports in America, the three top ports were New York, New Orleans, and Mobile. New Orleans and Mobile were shipping cotton out all over to Europe and the rest of the world. Incredible wealth had come to these places. And so Foster goes, leaves from here with 27 pounds of gold that Timothy Mayer had given him. And Timothy Mayer had paid him $35,000 to do this, and promised him 10 of the enslaved people when they get back. So Foster, if he did this, risking his life mission, and went to Africa, he was looking at making about $1.5 million in today's money. So he was purely a mercenary going to do this. So he's gathered these people from Mobile, which was like a Pirates of the Caribbean kind of port. You have to, I mean, there were foreigners all over, money everywhere. It was a very exotic place at the time. So he gathers up these itinerant sailors. They don't know that they're on a slaving mission, and they leave. So Mayer, they set sail. Right after they get past Cuba, they hit a hurricane that just does bad damage to the ship and almost tears the rudder off. The ship is crippled. It can't make an Atlantic crossing. So they pull into a Caribbean port and to repair the ship. When they're in the port, well, before they get to the port, one thing happens. They're being chased by an anti-slaving squadron ship, a British man-of-war, patrolling the waters for slaving ships. And even with his rudder almost torn off and the ship heavily damaged, Foster decides to run instead of surrender and let them come on board and make sure he's not transporting people. This tipped off his crew because the ship, they thought they were carrying a huge load of lumber going to the Caribbean, yellow pine from Alabama, and they would come back with a load of rum or sugar. It was a standard. You have to think of these ships as the 18-wheelers of the 1800s. They were delivering goods all over the place. So the crew figures out that the wood down is just a cover. There's only a layer of wood. Under the wood are supplies for keeping 100+ people alive in the hold of the ship on the way back. And they realized instantly they were on a slaving ship. And so they mutinied. Foster offered to double their pay, and they said, okay, we'll go. So they fixed the ship. They sailed to Africa. They went to Ouida, which is in modern day Benin, which is next to Nigeria. And the reason they went to Ouida is because the Mobile newspaper had an article in it saying Ouida has reopened to the slave trade because Ouida had signed a treaty with the English that they wouldn't do slave trading anymore. And a new king came in and said, you know what, we're going back to the family business. So Ouida at the time was one of the top 3 slave ports in the world, and had been for hundreds of years. The other slave ports, very famous and everything, but Ouida was in that group. And, a Dutch slave trader from the 1600s wrote, you could go to various ports around Africa and get 3 or 4 people in a week. You could go to Ouida and have thousands in an hour. And that, so that tells you they had industrialized the capture of people, the capture of fellow Africans to sell them. So in the Mobile newspaper, Foster and Mayer read, Ouida's reopened, people can be had for $60 a head. So that's where they sail. They get there. And of course, the slaving squadron is a big deal. Foster's worried about being captured and being hung. And the heat's kind of on. There had been a number of captures and everything. So he gets there, they anchor the boat. He gets taken ashore to negotiate with a prince who is one of the king was King Glele. And so they go there, and Foster is ready to negotiate the day he arrives, and they don't let him talk to anybody related to the sale for 8 days. And so he thinks he's being set up for capture, and he writes about this in his journal. And he's thinking they're going to wait, they're going to load my ship up with people, they're going to take my 27 pounds of gold, and they're going to set the slaving squadron on me, and I'll be captured before I ever leave. This almost happens. But Foster comes into an incredibly strange country, and we learn a lot about it from Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Barracoon, about the experiences of Cujo Lewis. So simultaneously, while Foster is sailing across the Atlantic, the Homan Army is marching to capture people, to have more people for sale. When the Homan Army marched, now you have to think of this country is about the size of Georgia or Alabama or Pennsylvania. And the Dahoman kingdom was about the size of a big city in one of those states, Atlanta, Philadelphia. And so for 300 or 400 years, the people in Atlanta or Philadelphia captured millions, 3 or 4 million people from the rest of an area the size of those states. Just to get that in your head as like, this is a small area and they're killing everybody. So they go march out 50,000 people. Their army is 50,000 people strong. And they in this case, went to Cujo's village and attacked it. And he writes about how the attack happened. And one of the things he talks about are the female warriors. So anyone who's seen the Black Panther movie with the female warriors of Wakanda, that's based on the Dahoman Army in Benin. What it actually was, there was a king who had a twin sister. The king died, and his sister decided to take over and masquerade as the king. And so she assembled an all-female guard around her so no one would know she was a woman. Well, this guard of 100 or so people spread to 5,000. And subsequent, they were so protective and vicious, subsequent male kings who came after this imposter twin sister kept the female army intact. So there was this elite shock unit of 5,000 women warriors. And so when they attacked Cujo's village, the men all waited outside the gates surrounding, it was a fortified village, with a wall around it. They waited outside. The women climbed ladders, went into the village, and attacked in the dead of night. And Cujo writes about these women running around cutting off people's heads and cutting their jawbones off to keep as trophies, taking their heads. It's incredibly brutal. It's horrific to read. And there are so many historical accounts talking about the exact same thing written by Europeans, British in particular, naval officers and stuff. We know this is what happened. And so that's the world that Foster ended up in. That's what was going on in Africa. You and I spoke earlier about what we were taught growing up. What I was taught in Atlanta, Georgia public schools was that white men from America and Europe went to Africa with nets and went in the woods and threw nets over people and caught them. Well, that's kind of preposterous. The earliest stages of the slave trade in the 1400s even, there were Europeans who went into North Africa and took people. But by the time of the Clotilda and by the time of all the people who were brought to America, that's not the way this was playing out. Certain African kingdoms like the Dahomans had decided, okay, we can make a good living catching other people and selling them. And that's what was going on at this point. The Dahomans had industrialized the capture of fellow Africans and the deportation of them. People think of slavery as an African thing. It wasn't. They caught people, they sold people. Slavery was what happened when they got to the places they were sent. What happened in Africa is they were stolen from their homes, from their families, and sent away from everything they knew for the rest of their lives.
One thing I was actually curious about is how they determine who was going to be valuable, because of course this is all contingent upon the white gaze of are you sellable and are you valuable somewhere else? But how could that happen with the immediacy of violence and the dead of night and beheading? How can you look at somebody and determine you're sellable that quick with violence happening?
Well, so you bring up two critical things about what happened. The first, the only metric that they used during attacks was age. If you were between 12 and 30, you were captured. If you were younger or older, you were killed by the Dahomans. That was how they operated. So when they attacked a village, they left no one behind. No one alive was left in that village. And it was purely, this is the prime age for people to sell. And we're going to keep those people. So then when they had captured all these people and they marched them for days and days, in Benin, they would take them first to Abomey, which was the capital of the Homan Empire. And they would be sorted. And so if you had a skill, you were a baker or an artisan, you made jewelry, you made, anything, a specialized skill, the Dahomans would likely keep you and enslave you themselves for the royal court. But if you were just a warrior, Cujo had trained for 5 years. He was 19 when he was captured. Cujo Lewis, who's most people familiar with any aspect of the Clotilda story, know about it from Cujo because he was interviewed by Zora Neale Hurston and in a really wonderful incredible historical work by her. You know, I can't give her enough credit for the way she captured his story. But so if you had no skills that were marketable to the Dahomeyans, then you were sold. So that was kind of the break point. First it was age, and then it was there, are you useful to us? And people they didn't deem useful, farmers, just regular folks, they were the ones shipped across the ocean.
Oh, thank you. I think it's important for us to think about the disposability of Black people in this enterprise on all sides of the Atlantic and within the global world. So
well,
it's
how many cultures were lost? Yes. That's the other aspect. You know, a village, you go in and you wipe out a community of 50,000 people or something. Mm-hmm. What is lost? How many, you know, that village's tales and legends. And I mean, we don't know what the human cost in Africa, never mind the cost across the oceans where the people were sent. I feel like it's one of the hidden legacies of slavery that we barely have scratched the surface of understanding what that did to that continent and to the global.
Yeah, you're right, because we privilege the narrative of those who were taken and transported into the Americas, and then we don't realize the cost on those left behind, and violence could ensue all the time.
You know, a way to look at that, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure, no, we're in it.
Right now, France is returning the Benin bronzes to Benin and Nigeria. These are exquisite works of art, metalwork done in the 14, 15, 1600s, that when France took over and colonized, they defeated the Dahomeyans in 1892 and colonized Benin. They took all this stuff and they're giving it all back now. And it's beautiful art. And just to the point of what has been lost.
Yes, there's been a lot of losses, and even more the loss of human life, culture, and its potential for evolution that was happening. So what next I sort of want to move to that struck me when we're sort of thinking about what may look haphazard and random is how you have the closeness of ties of people that are landed, of course, through the process, through the passage itself. We want to assume that became solidified in the making and unmaking of enslaved people within that world. But as we think about their landing within Alabama and within Mobile, can you talk about that? Can you talk about sort of, because now we're extending this conversation of the secreted world. You know, how do you make available what is really illegal? So, yeah, if you could speak to that.
Well, you know, the Clotilda gives us a really interesting window into American culture and the global cultures that came from Africa. You know, we've all heard, oh, the blues came from Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. The Clotilda gives us that information in an unassailable form. It is so clear what came aboard the Clotilda, because when they arrived here, they were documented by people in Alabama in the 1860s by enslaved people and by, you know, the masters, the owners, all the doing all these things. They came in singing songs of lament that were so sad and blood curdling. They danced. They did all these things, and they cooked, and they were famous. The Africans that came in on the Clotilda were famous for the stews and things they made. There's a wonderful Netflix show called High on the Hog, and I recommend it to everybody. The first episode is about Benin and about what we have from Benin. And one of the most potent things in that is the word for okra. So okra and black-eyed peas come from Benin. The word for okra in Benin is gumbo. I mean, that right there is an incredibly powerful connection. When you hear John Lee Hooker sing about, I'm going to get me a mojo hand, that's Benin. Benin is where voodoo came from, the Dahomeyans. Vodun, they call it. It's the voodoo religion. The way it got spread around the world was in people taken from Benin by the Dahomeyans and sent to Brazil and Haiti and here. So we see these connections. Here we are in 1860. And we have this verification that so many aspects of American culture came straight out of Africa. And it's really fascinating.
I will say I found it very interesting too, how it was almost a demonstration of they're not from Africa. So then, you know, when one was even asked, where are you from, to then lie and say, I'm from South Carolina. Right. So how that was already planted in the mind of Black people already to disown your own experience even as soon as you get there.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a whole other tactic that I sort of really didn't see coming. So
Well, that's part of the Clotilda story, because they got captured so late in 1860. We know more about the people on the Clotilda than we know about any other enslaved people, essentially. And because, they were interviewed multiple times in the 1800s, simply because, and they were, the journalists were treating Mayer as a swashbuckling, the last slave ship. He was this hero. And journalists were coming to see the Africans, to see the proof that he had done this, and to see Africans and their Africanness. Yeah. And so that, that was just such this, I thought that was so powerful. And then these people get interviewed up until the 1930s, the Clotilda Captives, and they were still, in the public mind. So we learned so much from them about the Middle Passage, which you have written extensively about. And the truth is, the Clotilda passengers, 9 of them were interviewed in 1909 by this woman, Emma Roche. And so we have their stories. And so they make up a lot of what we have about Middle Passage, life in Africa, what it was like to be in an African slaving raid as the victim, what it was like to be in a barracoon. These are stories that came to us in the 1900s. That's when they were documented, because these people were captured so late. By the time of the Civil War, almost all of the enslaved people in the United States had been born in America. There were very few who had been brought from Africa who were still alive. And we were not yet listening to their stories at the time of the Civil War. So the Clotilda people give us this one last chance to hear the stories of people captured from Africa. And so they become kind of a proxy for all the enslaved people. Everyone whose ancestors arrived here in the hold of a boat, who can't know the stories of their ancestors because they weren't recorded, and they were, essentially faceless people just forced. The Clotilda is their story. And so people all over the country can read, all over the world, the African diaspora can read what happened to the Clotilda people and get a feeling for what happened to their ancestors. And that's what makes it such a powerful, powerful story.
It does. And I will say that it puts me even more in mind of Amistad because of this American fascination with, these Africans. And of course, it seems like it plays out a little bit different. We don't have the circus sort of, being able to pay a ticket to come and see them. But then yet there is this fascination with they're from Africa, and then what would emerge after. So let's, I would like to talk about Africatown. So we have this pre-Civil War narrative. Of course, they're being imported during this time, but then the 1880s and the flourishing, the seeing of so much more. Can you speak to that? And then I want to get us 100 years later to look at that irony.
All right.
Okay.
So something fascinating happened, what you're talking about. So that the Africans get freed 5 years after they get here. Well, these were not people born into American slavery, like the rest of the slaves in the country, the enslaved people in the country at the end of the Civil War. These were people who 5 years before had been free. They had been craftsmen, they had been farmers, they had been merchants, they knew how to handle money, they were used to owning property, they were used to being free. And so they're freed, and they immediately, one of the interesting things with the Clotilda story, they're brought here, 110 people. And because it was illegal, Mayer and his brothers who did this spread them around amongst themselves. Only 30 of the 110 people were sold to a slave dealer who only moved them about 2 hours away from Mobile to sell them. So they were all close together. And because they were all working for the Mayer brothers on their various plantations, Cujo, for instance, worked on a steamboat. He would visit regularly, traveling up the river, stopping in at the plantations where all of the people he knew were enslaved. Many of the Clotilda passengers were all from the same village, Bonte, where Cujo was from. The others, they'd been together in the Barracoon for a month, in the Middle Passage for 6 weeks, and then they're here for weeks before they get split up. So these people had months to develop bonds and things. So when the war ends and they're all freed, they all got back together. The ones who were at points north came to Mobile and got together with the people here. And they decided, okay, we're gonna go home. Let's go back to Africa. And so they started trying to figure out how much it would cost, and quickly realized, oh, that's a lot of money. And so then they settled on the idea that Cujo would ask Timothy Mayer to give them land, reparations, one of the first examples of reparations in the United States. And Mayer said no, but that's where they were. So they banded together, they went to work, they all got jobs. The men would go work in some worked in a gunpowder factory, some worked making shingles for the mayors, some worked in the shipyards, lumber yards. The women started farming. In Benin, in the culture there, the women were the farmers, and they would sell their wares at the market. So the women are farming, they're going to downtown Mobile, carrying baskets on their head. They were very famous around Mobile for the African style of transport, and they would sell vegetables. And the men at night, after they had worked their jobs, their hard jobs, would take reeds from the rivers surrounding Africatown and make baskets and sell those. They raised up enough money, they began buying land. So they were buying land from their former enslavers, and they built houses. They took turns building each other's houses. They built a school, they built a church. And Cujo has this great line where he says, "We Africans don't wait for the white people to give us a school. We build one for ourselves." And that's that right there. They built one for themselves. They stuck together. They built things for themselves, and they fought back. They didn't take it when the oppressive, Jim Crow Reconstruction era machinery tried to squash them, going on for decades. They fought back. And so, these are the critical things. So here we are in Africatown. It is growing by the 1880s. They've got the school. There were very few schools in the South where African Americans could get educated. So people started flocking to Africatown. American-born Black people were coming to Africatown because it was kind of becoming famous. It was being written about over and over in the media. By 1912, Africatown was the fourth largest community in America governed by Black people, which is a stunning thing. Booker T. Washington came, obviously Zora Neale Hurston came, Langston Hughes came with Zora. It was a famous place, and it was growing and prospering. And that's, it's a testament to the courage of the Africans, to the drive and tenacity that they came into this country, and they realized, okay, we're stuck here. Let's make a life. And they did. And it's really an amazing story.
It really is an amazing story. And it was dynamic for me to even also see the relationship of Booker T. Washington with all this. Because again, we lose sight of the leaders that are all connected in, the maintenance of Black culture all over, and even more with education. Do you want to speak perhaps even more with Booker T. Washington and Rosenwald and sort of that?
Sure. And you bring up Rosenwald, and most people probably don't know, but he was the CEO of Sears in 1900 in Chicago. And Booker T. Washington gave a speech there and talked about the need to educate the Black youth at the time. And they're coming out of slavery, and this was like a proselytizing mission for him. These people need education. When the Civil War ended, in Booker T. Washington's famous book, he writes that he didn't know if freed African Americans were going to be ready to govern themselves after the end of the Civil War. How can they go from being enslaved to governing themselves the next day? Well, here were the Clotilda people, and they showed it. The day that they were freed, they decided to make a community, and it was Africatown. And they decided to rule it according to their tribal customs back in Africa. They appointed one of their number to be the chief, and then they picked some others to be judges, and they lived by the dictates of their little tribal community. And then the rest of them would, kind of make sure everything was okay with the people they'd appointed to be leaders. Then we're getting to the school, the Africatown thing. So Africatown schools kept getting burned down, starting in the 1880s. And I'm sure they were being burned down by, whites in Mobile who were upset about the prosperous nature of the Africans who had opened grocery stores. Cujo's son had a grocery store. They were, their businesses were thriving and prospering, and white people were shopping at them. So the schools kept getting burned down. And so at one point it was in the early 1900s, they applied to the Rosenwald Foundation. So after Booker T spoke in Chicago, Rosenwald sought him out, and they agreed to create a foundation to build schools for African Americans in the South. they ended up building 5,000 schools. And there's only one left still teaching African-American kids today, and it's in Africatown.
All the more reason why the importance, again, in this longer history and herstory to Africatown. So you made a comment about that if Cudjoe and others had lived through until the 40s and the 50s, they would have seen this tremendous growth, that by the 70s, it's explosive and, you know, it's very vibrant. But then we get to the 1980s. So maybe we can speak to what was really generating this, you know, good explosion within it, within the space of it, that Africatown will become booming by the 1970s.
Well, two things happened. First, in about 1920, they built a road that ran along the Gulf Coast, Highway 98. And in Mobile, they decided to make the Highway 98 crossing. They didn't want it to come through downtown Mobile in the 20s because Mobile was thriving and all. So they decided, well, let's pick somewhere nobody cares about, and we'll put a bridge and a highway. And that was right in the heart of Africatown. So they built a 2-lane drawbridge and then a 2-lane highway that went right through downtown Africatown. And it actually was it brought a lot of prosperity to Africatown because people could come over the bridge, and everyone going along the Gulf Coast had to go through Africatown. They didn't go through Mobile. So there were restaurants, and actually there were, you know, that they were not segregated at the time. And so there were Africatown grew and grew and grew with this corridor for the road. And so there were barbershops and grocery stores and movie theaters and restaurants, pharmacies, everything you would want in a town. And Africatown grew around it. In 1927, the mayors leased some of their land to International Paper, who made a paper mill. And at first it was a small concern, but it provided a lot of jobs in the community from the 20s up into the 60s. And even further in the 70s. By the 70s, this was the largest paper mill in the world. And so something sinister begins to happen, which is the pollution. You know, Alabama, you have to understand, at the time pollution laws were non-existent. It was all about making money. And here we've got this classic environmental racism, a gigantic paper mill in the heart of an African-American community. So what did they do? They put another paper mill next door to the biggest one in the world. And that was actually International Paper's global headquarters for a long time. And then they started bringing in other factories. And so, you know, Africatown was built on land purchased from the mayors and some of the other plantation owners who had enslaved the Africans. So Africatown was actually encircled by property owned by their former enslavers, who busily began bringing more and more businesses in. And this began to have a devastating impact. Then we get into late 80s, 90s, the crack epidemic. And that sweeps through Africatown. Now, you know, I interviewed people who talked about teachers at school being on crack, but a great quote from this wonderful guy, Lamar Howard, who says, but mostly it was white people coming to Africatown to buy crack. So they're the ones who took the loss on it. But, you know, that's devastating the community. Then we get to 1992, and they decide to replace the 2-lane drawbridge with a high-rise 6-lane bridge and a 6-lane highway that follows the exact path of the old highway right through the heart of Africatown's downtown commercial district, and right through all the properties purchased by the original African settlers. So that 92 bridge, 1992, they destroyed all the last buildings built by the Africans, including Cudjoe Lewis's house, as well as his fellow captives, you know, shipmates, their houses. In the book, I interviewed Gary Lumbers, who grew up in Cudjoe's house because he was Cudjoe's great-great-grandson. The family still occupied these properties. And so the city of Mobile and the state of Alabama, as recently as 1992, took those properties by eminent domain and destroyed the heart of this community, the only community in America started by Africans. And just, they wiped it out. And they wiped out the entire commercial district. Africatown went from a community of, say, 12,000 people to today, there are fewer than 2,000. It's totally devastated. And one other thing happened that's critical to mention. The mayor, starting in 1880, had built a whole lot of shotgun houses in Africatown, 500. And in 1968, the grandson of Timothy Mayer announced that he was going to destroy them all. and he just moved the families out and bulldozed all the houses. And he did it in protest of the city of Mobile giving water and sewer service to Africatown finally, because the Africatown voted to join. There were two communities. There's Pritchard, a smaller town next to Mobile, and Mobile. Both were vying for Africatown to join their municipal zones for tax revenue. And so the Pritchard side offered water and sewer. Mobile, bigger city, offered water and sewer, and we're going to come pave your roads. So Africatown in the 60s went from dirt roads and outhouses to having plumbing and paved roads. And so to punish Africatown for this, apparently, this Augustine Mayor, the grandson of Timothy Mayor, told a newspaper reporter, this is all well documented, that he was tearing the houses down because the people probably wouldn't be able to pay for a water bill on top of the $4 a month rent he charged them. And he says they had all been fine without running water. They lived perfectly happy and healthy. You give them a bathtub, he won't know what to do with it. He'll probably store food in it. I mean, these are direct quotes from Timothy Mayor's grandson. And so in Africatown today, they wiped out 500 houses. You drive around Africatown today and you hit these city blocks that are totally bare. And you think, why is this forest here in the middle of this community? All those chunks of forest, those are old houses that the mayors destroyed in 1968 to punish the community for getting water and sewer.
Well, it sounds like the punishment was much more, and then we're thinking about eminent domain over Blackness, over life, right, its evolution. The other thing that I wanted that I'm grateful for, that I had read that you had in the book about the dissertation that came out in 1992, that same year that this massive highway would extend. And so then to be able to have those memories connected with those who were still.
And that's Natalie Robertson. I want to get her name out there. She wrote another book about Africatown, and she captured the last interviews with people who had grown up with the Africans and had known them, and an invaluable historical record, what she did, and she was a grad student, and wow, what a powerful piece of scholarship.
Yes, by far. In just a moment, we're going to be moving to, there's a ton of questions that are coming in, but I want to even sort of throw out, what do you feel like the future can benefit from within Africatown and what you're doing with your book? What would you like to see in the future that you feel can help to really move the needle on healing and reconciliation?
So the one critical thing that has to happen is we dig up the ship. We dig up the Clotilda. I have held pieces of the ship in my hands. It is in good shape. It is sturdy. The wood is ready. We need to dig it up and put it on display in a museum in Africatown. And not, right now, the county, Mobile County, bought a prefab metal building and put it in Africatown. And as a sort of makeshift museum, the building has just been built. That's not what this story deserves. We're talking about an incredibly important global artifact. There are only 13 slave ships that have been found, mostly in pieces, not whole. At the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., they have a piece of a slave ship on display. It's about the size of a brick. It came from a South African slave ship that sank in port in Brazil. Had nothing to do with the American trade. The Clotilda is the only ship that brought people from Africa to America ever found. And here it is, and it's intact. It's sitting in a river just a few miles north of Africatown. So the most important thing to do is dig that ship up, put it on display in a world-class museum in Africatown. We have a new museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that's the Legacy Museum, and it's a national monument for lynchings that happened. It brought $1 billion economic impact to Montgomery. So what I want to see in Africatown is a national monument to the enslaved, and it is dedicated to the Clotilda story. I talked about the Clotilda story as a proxy for the stories of everyone who had been enslaved. Well, let's make a museum using their stories for what they are. These are the stories of everyone who arrived here in the hold of a boat, and we have them. So let's tell them. Right now, the Smithsonian and the French government are building 2 museums in Benin, $25 million apiece, dedicated to telling the story of slavery in Benin. Well, here we have the ship in Africatown. and we need to dig it up. The state of Alabama keeps refusing to say they'll dig it up. They keep talking about building a concrete pier at the site where I found the ship upriver. That would be like a Pearl Harbor World War II style, memorial. That's fine. You can build that, but the ship needs to be dug up and put on display in Africatown. We have dug up multiple Civil War era ships, ironclads in Mississippi, the Hunley, the first submarine used in war during the Civil War. It can be done. And the Clotilda is in fine shape. It's ready to be dug up. The Vasa, a Viking ship 1,000 years old, was dug up out of the harbor in Stockholm and is on display. We can dig up the Clotilda. It's just going to take money and the will to do it. And we cannot let Alabama be so negligent that it doesn't do this. Alabama will not be able to afford it. It's going to cost $10 to $20 million. Alabama can't do it. The state is perpetually broke because of its regressive tax system that also harms. Well, anyway, the Clotilda is going to have a lot of friends in this country. There are people listening right now who probably could pay $10 to $20 million to dig it up. If we need an act of Congress to fund it, we need to do it. This is an internationally important artifact, and it needs to be on display in Africatown. When I was interviewing folks in the book, I mentioned this fellow Lamar before. He said to me, when I went to Memphis and I saw the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was called, I cried. Was killed. I cried. We've got that same history here in Mobile with the Clotilda. That saying, the truth will set you free. Well, the ship is the truth. And that's what he said. And he was absolutely right. And so we need to put that on display. We can send pieces to the Smithsonian and to Benin, to those museums or whatever, but there is no reason on earth that Africatown should not have a museum housing the ship that brought the people who settled Africatown on display in the community where their descendants still live today.
Okay. Wow. So I want to jump to questions from our audience. We only have a few more minutes, but all right, our first question, which I think is right in line, it's important for us to think about the context of how Alabama is responding. So this question is from Bob H. Did you encounter any resistance to your investigation from locals who didn't want you digging into the past?
Yes. The most prominent resistance was when I was told that Joseph Mayer, who was one of the 3 great-grandsons of Timothy Mayer, a notorious racist, he died in March of 2020, a notorious racist. When I wrote my first article about looking for the ship, I was told he wanted to cut me in half with a sword. That was the threat that he had made. And 3 weeks before he died, in March of 2020, Joe Mayer was in one of the fanciest restaurants in Mobile and very loudly told the maitre d' who was sitting him at a table, I won't sit next to those, and he used the worst pejorative he could, and very loudly in the restaurant, and made a huge scene and insisted on being sat somewhere else away from some African American folks at a table. That's who that guy is, and Alabama. I've lost my train of thought because I get so fired up talking about it. So I did lose some friends over this story who had grown up with the Mayers, people I'd known for decades. And they said, you're ruining the Mayers' retirement. And I said, well, this is an American story. The Mayers need to come to the table. Everybody in Africatown keeps asking them to come and meet with them. The people in Africatown, the descendants, they want to hear the Mayers say, hey, we're sorry that our ancestors did this, so that they can say, it's okay, we forgive you. And they want that reconciliation moment. Yes. And that's what's being denied to them by the Mayer family. So, to your point, yes, I did, to the question, I did feel some heat for doing this. And, those are the kind of people I like to thumb in the eye any way I can. So, bring it on.
Well, thank you for being the bulldog, and moving this forward. So there's definitely a lot of thank you for your work. More importantly, thank you for putting Africatown in the center of our minds. And some are asking, what do you think the future can hold with the museum and perhaps even beyond? How do we begin to think about the descendants and then to begin to almost begin to reinvest in Africatown?
Well, I have a 25-year-old son. And I'm a child of the South. I was born in Alabama. I grew up in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida before moving to the Northeast as a teenager. My son talks about, and he's gone to school here in Alabama, and he says, all that racism stuff, that's your generation. That's not part of my generation. That's you and my grandparents. You guys are all hung up on that. And, I was in public schools in the mid 70s in Georgia, part of the first group of school busing and all that stuff. That's not been his experience. So when I hear him say things like that, and I okay, the ball is moving, whether I can perceive it or not. And we just need to keep doing that. I think culture, all races are so much more prominent in our cultural zeitgeist these days than they were when I was a kid. America is no longer this place ruled by white people, not culturally. And so I remain optimistic. I think we need to own the past and be ready for the future.
Yeah, definitely. I'm quite struck at the very generational revelation. And that's you and your grandparents, but we're not dealing with it because we're not being taught it. So then at that point, we're not just thinking about, is there folklore? Is that real? But then it's like, we're not taught it. So why is it a big deal? So maybe as an outro, even though this is probably a big one, how do we begin to put Clotilda, make it important as the pushback is there on race and its integration in even the American education system?
Well, the first thing I would say is this whole argument about critical race theory.
Yes.
No, it's history. This is the history of America. People can shy away from it and hide because they think it makes them look bad, or the way they feel today, they know is not okay. I think that's more what that's about. But this is the history of our nation, and we have never gotten anywhere by hiding from it or ignoring it. We need to deal with it and move forward. And that's what we can do. And we have a chance to do that, and we should be inspired by what's going on in Benin. I was stunned when I went to Benin to discover they're having talks there about reparations and reconciliation related to the slavery era. And when you look at what happened in Benin, it's actually a much more intense connection. Everybody on the Clotilda, everybody involved with the people on the Clotilda, everyone who captured them, and all the people on that ship all came from Benin. As I mentioned, a country the size of Pennsylvania or Georgia or Alabama. And so today, the descendants of those people are all still there. Everyone in Benin was either in a tribe that was capturing people or a tribe that was being captured. And it's led to this situation now where the Dahomeyans, who were the capturing tribe, are still the dominant ethnic group. They control all the wheels of government. But all the other tribes they captured are collectively more people, and they're grumbling. And so the government in Benin is worried about a Rwanda-style tribal genocide emerging. And so they're actively working to shut it down. And they're not shutting it down by keeping it quiet. They're shutting it down by talking about it. There are statues all over Benin. When you ride around that country, you'll just be riding along the highway, and there's a statue of a man on his knees, bound and gagged and handcuffed from behind. And that statue is there to make you ashamed for your family's role in slavery. And you see them all over the country. It's a really interesting moment there. And they talked about, I met with government officials, I met with people on all sides. And there are villages there where the descendants of the other tribes that were captured won't shop in stores owned by the Fon, the Dahomeyans. They won't send their kids to school with them. And so they're actively trying to have a reconciliation about that. The first time most Americans heard anything about these ideas of reconciliation was when the president of Benin came to a church in Baltimore in the early 2000s and said, in the church, he said, I want to apologize for my country. We did this. We sold you. We sold our brothers and sisters from Africa. We sold them to the white people. And it was taking ownership of that. And it was a healing moment, in all kinds of ways. And that's the direction forward. This stuff happened, and we can move forward, or we can keep trying to tamp it down and keep it under the rug and not move forward. But, let's put the ship on display and move forward.
Let's do that, because the ghosts are lingering. They want to be remembered, and it is time to invoke So Ben,
Absolutely.
it has been such an honor. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for being here. This has really been incredible. And let this be the beginning, not the end, but the beginning of so much more. Also in our remembrance. So now I want to turn it over to Marcia. But again, this has been incredible. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you for being such a great host. This was great.
You're welcome.
And I just want to thank you both for your work, Ben. Here's the book. I have it. It's wonderful. Sowande, thank you for your scholarship and your work. It's also important. I want to let everybody know that this has been recorded and it will be posted tomorrow on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube page. So I think that will go up in the chat. And I hope that you'll explore the other programs we have coming up. Later this week, actually, we have more history in a much more local way. We will be hosting a program about the Naturally 62 fashion show, which took place in Harlem 60 years ago and is credited with one of the things that influenced the Black is Beautiful movement. We'll have Imani Perry here the week after. We're going to talk about how civil wars start. There's a lot of things coming down the pike, so please keep coming to our programs and exploring what we have coming up at the Brooklyn Public Library. Thank you again, both of you. It was a fascinating, amazing conversation, and the hour flew by. Everyone, thank you for being here. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Are we clear? Hey, you did great. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I tried.
Yeah.